All right, sorry about that. That took a lot longer than I expected. This afternoon, we're going to talk about feature testing with Capybara, which will build on Andrew's lesson using Nokogiri. So we won't be directly using Nokogiri, but it's important to understand what Nokogiri is doing because Capybara uses Nokogiri behind the scenes. If you were to look in your gem file, gemfile.lock, once we put Capybara in there, you'll see that one of the dependencies is Nokogiri. So we're going to start out with the slides. If you want the slides, if you just scroll up in Slack, I posted them somewhere up here if you want those, but it's not necessary. All right, so feature testing with Capybara and Sinatra. I actually don't know if you can still see when I share my screen, so I'm just going to go with that. So we have Task Manager, and it works, but it's not tested. We have our model tests, but the actual web functionality is not tested. So what we'll need to do is use some kind of testing framework that will allow us to mimic a web interface. So we don't have great tests yet. We're going to fix that with Capybara. By the way, as we're going through here, if you think of any questions, I am going to have my phone Slack open on the 1602 channel, and I'll go ahead and answer those as we go through. Let's see. All right, so what is a capybara? As you probably Googled during lunch, you saw that it's a herbivore that lives in South America. It's debated whether the capybara or the beaver is the largest rodent in the world. So you can do some more research on that on your own if you would like. But what we're really concerned about today is that it's also a test framework. And what this test framework is what it does is allow you to test any RAC-based app. And it uses RAC tests behind the scenes. So we haven't talked a lot about RAC yet, but what RAC is a protocol for Ruby applications, Ruby web applications specifically. So if you remember in your HTTP project, if you did that, you had to figure out a way to return to the server three things. You had your headers, you had your status code, and you had your body. What RAC does is creates an interface, or I guess it's not so much an interface, but just a protocol for how those three things are going to be returned. So a basic RAC app is an app that accepts a hash of arguments, and those are going to be things coming from the request. So the verb, the path, the content type, all that kind of thing. And what it returns once it's done processing is an array where it has the status, the headers, and the body. So that's what we mean when we say a RAC-based app. Sinatra is, if you have a Sinatra app, that is RAC-based. Rails is also RAC-based. I believe Padrino is also RAC-based. So RAC, you can think of as like the protocol for a Ruby web application to be able to work with any server. So getting back to our slides here, Capybara allows us to test any of these RAC-based apps, and it uses RAC tests behind the scenes. And what RAC test does is it will kind of hijack the process of creating those requests and receiving a response rather than actually going through that process. And so behind the scenes, it's using RAC test by default as a driver. And when we say driver, what we mean is a headless browser. A headless browser would be like your Chrome or your Firefox or your Safari or whatever, just without a graphical interface. So it's actually making these requests. It's receiving responses. You just can't see it working by default. Capybara is also really cool because it provides support for other drivers. So while it uses RAC tests by default, you could also use WebKit, Selenium, Poltergeist, and those will allow you to test JavaScript. In fact, you can use, I don't know if any of you have seen this before, but Selenium will actually open up like a Firefox session. Let me see if I can actually pull up an example of this. It might be cool to see. All right, so what I'm doing right now is I'm running a script that uses Capybara behind the scenes. And so I'm not touching the computer right now. Everything that's happening right now is in the script. So it's selecting from these drop downs, it's downloading CSVs, just selecting different options kind of automatically. And so this was a script that downloads behavior data about students, just like automate a process. This is using the Selenium WebDriver, which does exactly what you see here. It pops open a session of Firefox and will actually like go through and do everything that you ask it to do. So I'm gonna stop that process. And if we look at, let's see. We look at these lines of code right here. These are what are doing that. So I'm registering a driver. I'm saying I want to use Selenium. These are all just like configurations for it. So like, where do I want to export this data, etc. And then we're visiting a certain web address. We're filling in certain fields. We're finding a certain place on or a certain element. So this is something that has the class of black button, and we're clicking it. Then we select, this was the drop-down menu. So export stat is that drop-down that you saw. It's selecting behavior and then going through these things. So, and then downloading. So that's what Capybara is doing. It's basically like starting up an instance of a browser, but most of the time you won't actually be using Selenium, so you won't see it. In this case, I had to use Selenium because there was JavaScript involved in what's going on here. So the default rack test driver won't do that for you. All right, so back to the slides here. So if you need to use JavaScript, you'll have to choose a different driver like Selenium, like I just showed. So Capybara is used for what we call feature tests. What you did this morning with Andrew with model testing should have been pretty familiar to you in terms of what you did with testing in Module 1. Today is going to be, or this afternoon is going to be slightly different because you didn't do any testing related to like starting up an instance of a browser. So what do we mean when we say a feature test? There's lots of types of tests. Unit tests are what you are probably used to in Module 1. So you're picking a class and you're testing particular methods inside of that class. So if you remember mythical creatures, unicorn, centaur, medusa, any of those would be unit tests. So when you're testing your models, like task manager or task from this morning, you are going to be using a unit test. A model type of test is a type of unit test. An integration test tests how different pieces of your code work together. So this could either be multiple methods and how they interact, how their return values interact, or more commonly what you'll see is two different instances of different objects interacting. So if you remembered that test about Medusa turning people into stone, we had the person class and we had the Medusa class. That would be an example of an integration test because that's two different classes and two different instances working together. So a feature test is a type of integration test because it's going to test multiple pieces. In our case, we want to be able to test from the user's perspective. So what exactly does the user want? And this is a good place to start when you're testing. And the reason for that is because a client's going to come to you and they're going to say, I want an app that does this thing. When I go to this page and I click on this button and then I fill in this form and I click submit or whatever, then I should see something happen. And so that's a great place to start with a test because if you start with that test, you know that you're not going to be implementing anything that the user is not specifically asking for. So a feature test in our web application is going to mimic what the user wants to do. Clicking certain things, filling certain things in, opening pages, visiting certain things. And it's important to think when you're writing these feature tests that you don't want the feature test to know anything about your code implementation, or if you do need something, it should be very, very little. And the reason for that is because it should be based on what the user's perspective is. And from the user's perspective, they shouldn't know how is a task being created behind the scenes, like what is the database and where is it going into. that should have nothing to do with your feature test. And the most, or I guess the last thing here about feature tests, they're based on something called user stories. And we're going to practice writing a few user stories in just a second here. A user story is a way that the needs of the client are going to be communicated to the development team. So it was first introduced in with Agile development. Or sorry, it wasn't introduced with Agile. It was introduced with extreme programming, which you can go Google on your own if you're interested in that. But it's used with Agile. So what you'll see happening is you'll meet with your client. They'll give you some requirements. Some user stories will be written based on those requirements. And then when you bring the product back to the client, they may give you more features, which will then turn into user stories. So this last bullet point here kind of describes like, what is it? It's going to explain from the user's perspective what needs to happen in order to fulfill a certain feature of the application. So here's an example of a user story here. I'm going to start with, as a user, when I visit the homepage, I introduce a title and description for a task. I click the submit button, then my task is saved. So there's a pattern that you'll see commonly in these user stories, and that is we have as a some role, when I do something, and I do something, and I do something, and there may be multiple of these and I, but finally this would be our assertion, like then something. So in this case, then my task is saved. That's the outcome of all of these things put together. So the format, what you're going to follow when you practice writing these is this right here. So as a who am I? When I perform actions, I perform however many actions I need to, then I have some expected result, and that's what I'm going to test for. So here's what we're going to do. I want you to go ahead and choose, let's say, 2 of these options right here. So the first one, adding a task to Task Manager. So let's say that you're writing a user story for this, and you want to be able to say, like, as a something, when I do something and I do something and I do something, then I expect whatever for adding a task to Task Manager. How can we test that? Same with signing in for a new account, logging into an account. For these two, assume that either, like, you could either treat this as it's a separate app like Facebook or Twitter or whatever, or you could assume that your task manager has users associated. It's up to you. And then the last one would also be assuming that there's accounts and specific users. So when I am on Task Manager, I only see the tasks that are associated with my account, and I don't see like Andrew's tasks or Jeff's tasks or anyone else. So let's take 5 minutes or so and pick at least 2 of those. And then I'll call on a couple people to post their user stories in Slack, and then we can talk about those. So 5 minutes, let's get back together at 2:15 or so. All right, let's come back together and we'll start. I'll just call off some people who can post certain user stories. So let's start with Allie. If you can post one of the user stories that you wrote, it doesn't matter for which scenario, but we can talk about that. And then let's also have Claudia, if you can post another one. Again, it doesn't matter which one, just as long as you're not duplicating what has already been posted. And then Deb, if you can go ahead and post one after Allie and Claudia. You can just post it in Slack. All right, so Allie has adding a task to Task Manager. So as a user, so for the first line, we want to say like what type of user. So you could say as a guest or as a registered user, as an admin. Those are the types of users that we could put there. Then we have when I click on the new task button and I type in my new task and I submit my new task, then I should see my new task was created. You're definitely on the right track. A couple of suggestions that I would give here. So when we say type in my new task, we need to be more specific about like what are we typing in. In our case, we know that our task manager has a title and it has a description. So what I would want to see here is 2 lines and I type in, let's say, learn Sinatra in the title of the new task, and then a second line, and I type in, by Friday in the description field of my new task. So we would want to expand this to be a little more specific about what we're typing in and where we're going to be typing it, because we need to be able to tell Capybara where to do that. And I submit my new task. That sounds good. Then I should see my new task created. And that's true, but how would we know that it's created? What we would want to do here is check a certain part of the page. And this is where Capybara is going to be using Nokogiri under the hood, where we can target a specific element. So we could say the first list item in this unordered list should contain the title, or should contain a link that has the title in it. Or we could say the heading on the page, or some ID, some div with some ID, or some div with some class. So these 2 pieces we can get a little bit more specific with. All right, so Deborah has logging in to an account as a user. Let's see. Oh, okay, so that's meant to be the first line. So as a user with an account, this is very specific. I like it. So a user who is already registered, they have an existing account on the site. When I visit the dashboard page and I click on login, then I see a form to enter my credentials. This is definitely a good start. We would want to be able to flesh it out with something like, and I fill in war below for my username, and I fill in password for my password, and I click login, then I see welcome Rachel on the dashboard. So this looks good as a start. We would just want to flesh it out, fill in the form, fill in very specific pieces of the form, and then how do we confirm that we actually got logged in? Did anyone try either number 2? Let's see. Either number 2 or 4. I think those are the ones that we don't have yet. If anyone did try 2 or 4 and you want to post yours there, that would be awesome, just so we can see a couple more examples. So Claudia has, as a user, when I click on button new task and I type in today's task in the title field, and I type learning about Capybara in description, and I click submit, then my task is saved with a new ID and appears on the index page. Yeah, this looks good. So we have like very specifically, what are we filling in what fields, and then how do we know, like this right here appears on the index page, indicates to us that this thing was actually saved. Now, regardless of how our app actually implements that, the feature test doesn't care about. And that's how it should be. It should be from the user's perspective, and the user has no idea what's happening on the server side, what's happening when it goes in the database, or how we're doing that. So this is good. All right, as an existing task manager user, so this one is for, let's see, logging, what would this be? Okay, so this one is for number 4, viewing only tasks associated with my account. So we have, as an existing task manager user, and we would want someone who already exists in the database because they don't want to be signing up for a new account. When I visit the task manager site, I click on my tasks. Let's see, and I click on my tasks that should be on whatever page I arrive at. Okay, so assuming there's like a button or a link or something. Then I want to see a list of my tasks organized by due date that tell me which are not completed. So we could get as specific as we wanted here. And in this case, we probably would want to use some of those selectors so that we can target where specifically on the page do they appear. Is it the first list item? Is it the second list item? The last list item? If we're going to be organizing by due date, we would want to specify for that. So this looks really good. The only thing that I would encourage you to think about, and it's not part of the structure thing that I put here, so I wouldn't expect you to know this, but we would want to consider what should already exist in the database before we even get to this part right here. So we could say something like, as an existing task manager user with 3 tasks already in the database, then when I visit the task manager site, and we could keep going there. So for tests that need data to already exist, just be aware of that. All right, and then we have number 2 here. So as a user, and in this case, we could be like a guest user or an unregistered user. We would want to be specific about what type of user. So as a guest or an unregistered user, when I navigate to the new account page and enter a unique username, enter an adequate password, I like how we've specified 2 constraints here because we want the happy path of this test. We could create sad path cases as well where they don't enter a unique username, or maybe their password is too short or doesn't have the correct characters, but this makes it very specific that we're testing happy paths. So I like that there. Then I click submit, then a new account will be created and I'm redirected to the home page. This I like, redirected to the home page. Right here, from the user's perspective, we would want to figure out how do we know that our account has been created. So one way we could do this is that if upon this redirection, like if I get to the home page, then I could see a welcome message like welcome Patrick, or I might see my tasks on that page, only the tasks associated with me, but somehow, well, I guess you wouldn't have any tasks. So maybe just a welcome message like welcome Patrick, and then whatever else you assume would be there. But we want to think about like how the user would know that their account was created because they don't have access to the database directly. All right, before we do a quick Pomodoro, are there any questions that I can answer? Go ahead and post them in Slack if there are. If I don't see any, then we can go ahead and do a quick Pomodoro here, and then we'll move on after that. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so let's take 5 minutes or so. We'll come back at 2:28. All right, let's go ahead and continue here. So we'll go back to the slides. So just to recap, before we get into Capybara, we've talked about user stories. So these are what are going to come from your client's requirements. And so whatever your client wants to be able to do on this app will then be turned into user stories, which your developers will write tests off of. And those tests are going to be Capybara tests. So Capybara is going to help us query the DOM. And when we talk about DOM, we're talking about the document object model. And I'm not sure if Andrew touched on this on day one with the HTML review, but the document object model you can think of as the nesting structure in your HTML. So where you have an opening HTML tag and a closing HTML tag, and then within there you have your opening body tag and your closing body tag, and within there you could have many other tags. We're going to query those tags and interact with those tags as well. So probably the most simplistic way we can use Capybara is to use the visit method. And if you look at the top of that slide there, visit and then path, you'll hand it a path. So it needs to come in as a string. And if we're trying to go to /tasks, or maybe just the root of the app at /, we would say visit // or visit /tasks. Let me just make sure I have Slack up here in case there's any questions. Okay, cool. So what Capybara is doing behind the scenes is using that rack test driver to load the page. So it's actually going to make a request to that page, but it's not a real browser and it's not a real HTTP request. It's a faked out request using rack test. So that's commonly something that you'll see. Let's see, where did I have that? So right here, for example, visit and then a path would be an example of this visit. Once we get to that page, we can make an assertion. So we have assert page.hasContent. Page is an object that we get back from doing visit. So once we've said visit something, page is then stored by Capybara as the result of the request. With assert page has content, we can hand it an argument right here of a string that we would want to see appear on that page. So in conjunction, you might see something like this. Visit / that would be the root of our app, and then assert page has the content hello world. Notice that this is in quotes because everything that's coming back is going to be a string. So that's fine. Has content by itself is not great. So what we can do is kind of combine a couple things here. One thing is .has CSS, and what this will allow us to do is check that certain elements appear on the page. And I know this is kind of misleading. Andrew may have touched on this in the Nokogiri lesson, where CSS we normally think of as like styles. So you might think of like a font or a color or a size. In this case, CSS is actually referring to a CSS selector. So that could either be an ID, it could be a class, it could be just an element, so like an H1 or a div or whatever. And the reason that this has CSS is slightly better than has content is because if you're just testing for hard-coded things on the page, like let's say this is your copy text on your landing page, that could change fairly frequently. And that could also break your entire test suite if you're testing for something that's like hard-coded onto your HTML. So has CSS, although the content might change, your structure is probably going to stay pretty steady. So maybe there's a list of things. Let's say if you were Turing and you're talking about teaching X, Y, Z, and then suddenly Z is replaced by A, it's still a list, so we could still check that that list appears, but we wouldn't have to hard code that content in there. So a combination of those two would look like this. We say visit /. Once we've executed visit and then something, we get that object page. So we can now say assert page.has CSS and then passing in the CSS selector. So this CSS selector, this # here, is for an ID, and it's looking for anything that has an ID of hello. So has CSS is a little bit better, but if we kind of combine these two ideas of have content and has CSS, we get something a little more powerful. So that's this within block. What this is going to allow us to do is target a specific part of the page for certain content. So if we take this right here, this has CSS and then a CSS selector here, that will become this part right here. We're going to say within some CSS selector, that may be an ID, that may be a class, that may be just an HTML element. So within that, then in this area inside the block, we can now say assert page has content. And in here, you would want something dynamic. So something that's coming out of the database or something that's being generated based on what the user put in, rather than hard-coded text or something that's just like copy for your website. I'm just going to show you really quick before we get into the coding time what this would look like. I just realized I didn't have any super clear examples there. But if we come over here, all right. So we would say something like within, let's say we have a div that has the ID of tasks. So we're saying on that page, find something with the ID of tasks. And now we can assert that the page has the content of like some task that was created by the user. So learn Sinatra. So that's what it would look like. I don't know if that's big enough on the video. That's what this implementation would look like, combining finding or targeting specific CSS selectors with content that should be on the page. But again, this would be like dynamic based on whatever the user entered, not hard-coded copy from the developer side. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, but please feel free to put them in Slack. I have it on my phone open here. Can stop really quick and answer anything if you get confused. We're going to go ahead and try creating a capybara test together. And this test is just going to, it's going to be something that we're going to end up deleting because it's not going to be a real test, but I want you to be able to understand what is the setup necessary in order to get Capybara up and running. And yes, I can make my text editor really, really big. We'll go with that for right now. That's about how big we're going to get. And then also, if there's any code snippets that you want me to put inside Slack, feel free to ask and I can paste them in there. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to add a test and we're going to run it to verify that the front page, so that's going to be our landing page, has CSS of greeting. And again, we said # is ID. I can't stress the importance of knowing the difference between class and ID. So make sure you understand # is ID, period is class, and then just get used to being able to write tests that scope within those. Patrick, you said, maybe I missed it, but where's the # task come from? Good question. So if we go back here, # tasks, this is a fake test, but what I'm assuming is that I have some kind of div or some kind of, maybe it's a UI, sorry, not a UI, a UL, some HTML element that has an ID of tasks. So I'm going to write this inside here. Obviously, you wouldn't mix HTML and Ruby, but just to give you an idea, we could have a div. I could say ID is tasks. And now this test right here, it's going to get back whatever. So we could have an H1 up here. We could have like a UL down here with some list items. But this test specifically is only going to look inside of the element that has the ID of tasks. So when this all comes back, it's going to scope only into this area right here. And this line 2, assert page has content learn Sinatra, it would look in here and see, does it have the content learn Sinatra? So ultimately, what we would probably do is iterate through tasks. This is awkward because I'm typing Ruby inside of, well, an HTML file and then embedded Ruby. So we'd have like @tasks.each do task. And then whatever you want in here. So this could be like task.title or whatever is going to give us back to learn Sinatra. All right, so Patrick, you said, so it can just grab HTML IDs and classes. It can grab HTML IDs, classes, or just the plain elements. So maybe I wanted to change this test to, instead of within tasks, maybe I want to make sure this is the welcome message. So I might have welcome and then user.name or something like that. We're not going to implement user, so this is obviously very fake, but let's say we did have an instance variable user and it had a name. We could say within h1, so notice now I'm not using a class or ID, like this doesn't have an ID and doesn't have a class. It's just an element, h1, but we can still assert that certain things are in it. So we could say page has content, welcome, and let's say @user was me, so user.name would be Rachel. We could say welcome Rachel. And so now this test is going to look for the h1, so just within this opening and closing tag, and make sure welcome Rachel is in there, which it would be based on that. All right, so Claudia says, does that mean we can only grab onto CSS elements for these tests? Yes, and the reason is because this is from a user's perspective, and what's coming back to the user is going to be HTML. And so our HTML can contain just plain HTML elements like this with no class or ID on them. But it could also, if we wanted to tag it with some certain ID or class or whatever, we can also target it that way. Let's see. Yeah, Marina, you want the snippet? I'll go ahead and paste that in, just so that this is like very, like, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. Not arbitrary, but kind of contrived because we don't have like this user functionality, and that's not at all what our view looks like. And Thomas is right as well. You can have a class within whatever tag. So if we were going to do this with classes, I could change this to class tasks. And then if I come back here and change my tests, I'm going to use a period this time since it is a class. And I'm going to say tasks. So within something that has the class of tasks, it doesn't care what kind of element it is, but we just need to make sure that there's some content in there. So learn Sinatra or whatever. And now it comes down here, it says, oh, you have the class of tasks. So this is where I'm looking here. All right, these are good questions, so keep them coming if you think of anything. I'm gonna go ahead and keep moving here, but I'm happy to stop if anyone needs anything answered. So we're gonna be working in our task manager. So if you can all open up your task manager if you don't already have it open. All right, so we're going to start just from writing a test. And then we'll use that test to drive out the fact that we haven't included the capybara gem and we don't have anything set up in our test helper and that kind of stuff. But I like to start with the test because the test is what when I was learning, that's what I felt most comfortable writing, and the kind of like setup stuff was sometimes a little bit confusing. So in order to not put anything in setup that we don't actually need, we're just gonna use the errors to drive our development here. Okay, tons of questions. Let's stop here. So Thomas says, when we use capybara for tests, are we using it in a mini test file like we usually would? That's a very good question, and I did not actually cover that. Capybara you can think of as a supplement to either mini test or RSpec. So if you were using capybara, or if you were choosing to use RSpec as your testing suite, you can still use capybara. So it's just, think of it as like just like we use gems in our Ruby projects, just our like production code. Capybara is a gem that we use for testing. So it's just like an add-on feature that we can use in any test framework. Thomas, if that didn't answer your question, go ahead and like post a little bit more and I can get deeper into that. Marina says, could we see a website and what would be something that we could test for and how that test would look? I guess I'm trying to picture it. We're gonna do an example in just a second. So hopefully that will give you an example like in a project that you're working with. But again, Marina, if it doesn't answer your question there, once we have the example, feel free to ask another question. All right, Sunny says, why do you need dot class in a string as well within class? Good question. So the reason for this is because when we're writing this is Ruby code. So if we didn't have the string here, then Ruby, like this is not valid Ruby. If I come into IRB here and I say dot something, it's like, what is that? Syntax error. So dot something is not valid Ruby, which means if we want to specify something, we need to put it in a string. And then on Capybara's end, it takes care of taking this string and parsing it into a class, trying to figure out that this is a class or this would be an ID. All right, Genevieve says, would it be wrong to add an ID to something just for the purpose of testing an element? Normally, you're going to have classes and IDs that are used for styling anyway. So when you're writing the test, well, let me back up for a second. So if you're working on a team that has designers and developers, which is probably going to be the case, usually what will happen is that your designers will create your templates for you before anything starts. And so as a developer, when you're writing these features, you will already have those templates sitting in front of you. And so you can look at these templates, these HTML templates, and say, okay, clearly like something, you know, this piece of text needs to go inside of this div. And since those templates, those views are already styled for you, chances are they're going to have quite a bit of, or quite a few IDs and classes and things like that already put into them. You don't have to specifically use classes and IDs. So I'm gonna go a little bit off the tracks here just to explain one more thing, but this is not something that I expect you to have memorized today. So if this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. I can explain it like privately to you, or we can look at it a little bit later. So what I could do, if I didn't wanna give something a specific ID or class, I could say within, let's say, I want to target a specific list item. So I could say within li nth child 2. And I know this looks really bizarre. This is actually just CSS syntax. So this is not something special that Ruby or Capybara or Minitest or whatever is doing. This is just CSS syntax. So in this case, I haven't given an li, let's say I had like 3 li's or something. I haven't given this second li a specific ID or a class. But if I just said within li, then we would get an ambiguous match. And that's actually the error that Capybara will give us. It will say ambiguous match, more than one thing matches li, because it says it sees 3 of them here. So by doing li nth child 2, it's going to look, and this is also kind of weird, you know, in Ruby, we're used to seeing this as an index position, so we would assume this is the last one if this is 0, 1, 2. That's not the case with CSS selectors. They actually count 1, 2, 3. So this would be targeting this li, and then we wouldn't have to add a class or an ID onto it. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions here. So let's go over to Task Manager, and I'm gonna get out of here. Cool. So the first thing we'll need to do is create a folder for feature tests and make a feature test in there. So I'll do this from the command line since it's a little bit bigger. I'm gonna do make dir, and we're gonna be inside the test directory, and we want features. So this will allow us to separate our model tests from our features tests. And it doesn't seem like a big deal right now because we only have 2 model tests. We're only going to have about 3 feature tests, but it's really gonna pay off later when you may have 20 models that you're testing or 100 features. So we just want to be able to separate our tests there. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to create a test file. And again, like I said before, this is going to be a test that we end up deleting just because we're not going to use this. I just want you to see what a capybara test looks like. So I'm going to say touch test features, and let's call this, well, what were we testing for? Front page has the CSS greeting and the content welcome to task manager. All right, so let's call it user sees greeting on homepage underscore test.rb. And usually this is the convention for naming test files. So who is it from your user story? In this case, just any type of user should see a greeting on the homepage. So I'm going to say user. And then what is the outcome? They see a greeting on the homepage underscore test. So we'll make that. Then we'll come back over to that file. And these are going to be set up similarly to how we did our model tests. So I have Andrew's repo from this morning. We'll still need to require our test helper, and we'll still need to set up a test, include our test helpers, and then define a test. So let's go ahead and set that up. And the name of the class will usually match the name of the feature. So user sees greeting on homepage. We'll inherit from mini test. We'll include our test helpers. And let me just take a look back at there to see what we're getting from test helpers. So we're getting a teardown method to delete all of our tasks. And hopefully this makes sense to you from this morning why we want to do this. But if there's still any confusion, go ahead and put something in Slack and we can talk about it, why we would want everything deleted after each test. And then super is going to call the parent class's teardown method. The reason that I have this in here, it's not going to make any difference for this specific repo, but if in the case that we were overriding the teardown method and the teardown method provided something else for us, mini tests like inherent teardown method, then we would be losing it by not calling super. So this is just to make sure that we're not overriding functionality that we didn't intend to. Then we have task manager. So this is so that we can access the database. That looks good. And then def create task num equals 2. So we have a helper method here. Cool. That all looks good. All right. So now let's go ahead and write a test. We'll say like user is welcomed. And that is definitely not the correct syntax. Test user is welcomed. All right. So this one is a pretty straightforward, simple one, just so that you can see like the pieces that we need to get Capybara up and running. So we go back to the specifications here. We see the front page has the CSS greeting and the content welcome to task manager. So we wouldn't be able to see anything on this page until we visit somewhere. And so visit is generally going to be one of the first things that you do in a Capybara test, aside from any data prep that you need to do. So we're going to say visit. The path that we're going to is slash, just because it's specified here, the front page, we're going to assume that's the root path. And then our assertions down here. So we said it has the CSS greeting and the content welcome to task manager is within that CSS. So within that CSS kind of indicates to me that we want to do within, and we want to do an ID of greeting. So in quotes, I'm going to say greeting. So visit this, it will get back that page object, then check that page object for something called greeting and make sure that there is content in there. So we can say assert page has content, and that content was welcome to the task manager. Just also be cautious about your capitalization and punctuation. If I put this as downcase, then like if I had it as capitalized in the actual view, it's going to fail. So just whatever you put here, just make sure that you've remembered those like interesting things that you might have. So I have no space between task manager, I have capital T, capital M, and an exclamation point. So when I run this test and it's failing, I need to check for those things. All right, let me check Slack for any questions. All right, no questions so far. If you need me to post that in Slack, I'm happy to do that. I would also encourage you though to get used to typing these things out. I think one thing that tends to happen in the beginning of Module 2, especially when working on skill inventory and task manager and robot world, is that it's very tempting to copy and paste things. And if you're doing that, you're gonna run into some strange errors where you're in robot world, but it's like undefined method, name for task object. Some strange errors, and then also you're not actually going to get the practice of typing things out and getting that muscle memory. So I do encourage you to hand type everything, even if it's something that gets posted in Slack. All right, Ashwin says, what is self when we're in the scope of that test? Self would be the instance of this test class. So this is just like a regular mini test. It's just that this time we're going to be using Capybara. All right, so let's go ahead and run the test and we can make some predictions here. This should all be fine. That looks like a normal mini test setup. This should be fine because we used it in the model tests. This should be fine. This right here, we've given our application no reason to know what Capybara is. So we should get undefined local variable or method visit on line 7 of this test. The reason that I'm saying that to you before we run the test is because that's another good habit to get into, is before you run your test, think about what exactly is gonna happen. That's gonna help solidify your understanding of how these pieces all work together. I'm gonna come back to my terminal and I'm gonna run Ruby test features, and I called it user sees greeting on homepage. Okay, so we're gonna run it. And big errors here. All right, could not find WebRick in any of the sources, so I don't think I bundled before I did this. You probably got a different error. All right, let's try it once again. Okay, so we're looking down here at the error, no method error, undefined method visit, and that's what we predicted. Visit comes from Capybara, and we don't have Capybara yet. So the first thing I would do is I'm gonna add Capybara into my gem file. Just listed under the rest of them here. And go ahead and bundle so that your gemfile.lock gets updated. I just ran bundle if you didn't see that. And everything already is installed on my machine. You will probably, unless you've used Capybara before, it will probably give you an installing Capybara notice there. And then if I look back at my gemfile.lock, I can see Capybara is now in here. And just like we said in the beginning of class, it depends on nokogiri. So that's how Capybara is able to scope to specific places in your HTML files. Rack test is that driver that I was talking about. This is going to provide that basically like a web browser without that graphical interface. Okay, so that's the first thing I need to do. Second thing, I think if I run it, I'm gonna get the same error. And that's because I've included the gem, but I haven't actually required it anywhere. So again, we're getting undefined method visit. So I'm gonna come into my test helper and I'm gonna say require, let's see, I think it's Capybara. Let's see, Capybara DSL, I believe. Let's try that. Again, I don't know if this is going to fix that error completely because I believe the last thing we need to do is include, just kind of like we did here, we need to include the actual DSL, which will give us visit and page and has content. So let's try this again. And I think we'll get that same error. Okay, so again, same error. And then the last thing that we're gonna do here would be include capybara DSL. DSL stands for domain specific language. Domain in this case is like testing with a web framework. And then the language that we're getting out of it, it's not like a actual language, but it's like the terms that we're getting. So visit, page, has content. There's a whole bunch of other capybara methods that we can use in order to interact with the page. But for right now, those are the ones that we've seen. All right, so we have that. Let's run it one more time. Okay, so we're getting a new error, and this is kind of cool. Rack test requires a rack application, but none was given. So let's try to figure out what this means. Rack test requires a rack application, but none was given. So this gets back to what I was saying at the beginning of class, where Capybara can work with any rack-based app. So it's not having a problem with Capybara anymore, but it doesn't know when we say visit slash, which app do we want it to visit slash for? And in our case, if I go to app controllers task manager app, I see class task manager app here. This is my app. This is my rack-based app that it's complaining about. So we somehow need to tell Capybara that when we ask it to visit slash, we want it to visit slash of task manager app. And the way that we do that is I'm gonna go back in my test helper here, and it doesn't really matter where you put this. I guess I'm just gonna put it right underneath. The syntax for this is capybara as a constant, so with capital C. I'm gonna say capybara.app equals, and then the app that I want it to use. And I saw that that app was task manager app. The reason I know I'm using this constant as opposed to any of my model constants or whatever is because this is the one that inherits from Sinatra base, and we said Sinatra is rack based. So this is the actual constant that we need to use. So we'll say task manager app. And so that one line will fix this error that we had here. Rack test requires a rack application, but none was given. Now we've given it an app, task manager app, and it should be able to execute visit slash. All right, not seeing any questions on Slack, but feel free to post them if you are lost or need a code snippet or need an explanation. Okay, so we should get a new error. Let's make a prediction here. So in our test, I think we'll be able to get past line 8 because we've given it a rack app and we have slash. Okay, so that should all be fine. This part right here, I don't think we have anything with the ID of greeting on our dashboard view. So we saw that when it goes to slash, it's rendering the dashboard view. So I'm going to open up the dashboard and just double check that I don't have anything called greeting. So class row, class call MD6, blue, and that's all the classes we have. No IDs. So that's where I'm guessing it will fail. On line 10, it won't be able to find an ID of greeting. Okay, so we look here, capybara element not found, unable to find CSS greeting. So we were accurate in the prediction there. So to fix this error, we need something that has the ID of greeting. So I can come back to that view. And well, we already have this kind of greeting thing. So maybe what we want to do here is just append an ID to this H1. So I could say ID equals greeting. And notice that I'm not putting the pound sign here. And the reason is because this right here translates into the pound sign when we're, well, this side doesn't translate it, but when we're going from the other side where we say within something, that's going to translate to ID. So you don't need to put pound sign ID or dollar or period in the actual string of the ID. If I run it now, I should get past this error that I was getting before, where it said unable to find CSS greeting, but now my text doesn't match. So I had no period here and I had an exclamation point at the end, So I'm not going to fix it just because I want you to be able to see what the error that we get is. So let's run it one more time. Okay, so now we're getting a failure, and this is where assert, let me go back here. This is where these lines don't give you a ton of help. Because it's assert instead of assert equal, it's just checking that this returns a Boolean value of true. And so if it fails, it's going to tell us like it failed the assertion, it returned false when you expected it to return true, but it's not going to tell us why. And so when we look at that error message, we see that here. Failed assertion, no message given. But it does tell us the line number. So I'm not sure how deeply you felt comfortable like digging into reading error messages from module 1, but in module 2, it's vitally important that you are able to look at not just what the error is, but where it's coming from as well. So we see on here, it's coming from test features user sees greeting on homepage test, line 11, and that's the line that I was referring to, line 11 here. So now it's saying that it's failing because it doesn't have welcome to the task manager on the page. And that makes sense because we didn't put welcome to the task manager. So now I'm going to fix it. I'm going to get rid of that space. I'm going to put an exclamation point on the end. And I think we should now have a passing test because, let's see, welcome to the task manager. Welcome to the task manager. So we have the ID of greeting and we have the text that matches there, and that's all that we're asking for in this test. So let's run it one more time and we should have a passing test. Cool, passing test. This right here has to do with the way that, so tilt is the templating, I don't know what you call it, interpreter, I guess. ERB is one way that you can template your files. Those funny tags where you use like less than, percent, equal, whatever. That's ERB, but there's also Haml and Slim and a whole bunch of other templating, I don't know what the word is, templating, not languages, but styles, I guess. So for some reason, it wants us to explicitly require tilt/ERB instead of just assuming that it's going to be required. So if you want to get rid of that error, it's not going to blow anything up, but if you want to get rid of it, all you need to do is in your test helper, just somewhere add that line, require tilt/ERB. And then you'll still have a passing test, you just won't see that warning there. All right, let me check Slack for questions. Okay, so Thomas says, is app at the end of the constant convention or required by Sinatra? Good question. So I'm assuming you're referring to this right here. It's not convention and it's not required. You could do it just as easily by having this gone and this gone right here. The reason I didn't do that is because we have a class called Task Manager already as a model. And so I wanted to differentiate between the fact that this is the Sinatra application, whereas this right here is just a model. So that's why I put app on the end, but it's not convention or required. All right, Marina says, can you copy the greeting snippet? I'm getting an error on mine. I'm assuming, let's see, I'm assuming you mean the test, but if you mean something else, I can go ahead and paste that as well. All right, and Claudia says, could we change the assertion to assert equal, welcome to task manager, .page.has content to get more information. So page.has content needs an argument on it. Like we see here. And I believe, well, I've never actually tried this. Let's try it and see what happens. Interesting. So let's try your suggestion of assert equal. I'm going to put something random in first to make sure that it fails. Okay, expected that actually got true. So it looks like if we don't give it an argument, page.has content, it's just going to automatically return true. So that syntax doesn't look like it works. What you can do though, if you want an error, is just add an optional argument on the end. Assert, and you can do this without capybara as well. If you said like assert true, well, that's not gonna really make a lot of sense. But if we said like assert this dot is a string, that's gonna return either true or false. And if we wanted more of a description about it, we could say like, it is not a string. And now when we run that test, let me comment this out. It should pass because that is a string. But if I changed it into like 5 is a string, then we get this custom error that we created. It is not a string, and that comes from this. That's not necessary. You don't have to have it there, but if you don't have a custom error message, then you just get like failed assertion, no message given. So if you want a custom error, you can put this down here like content or like reading is not on page. It's up to you. All right, going back to Slack here. All right, the dashboard. I'll go ahead and copy that in. And Genevieve says, will you be showing us if we wanted to test for dynamic content, how we would set that up? And the answer is absolutely yes. We're gonna actually delete this test in just a second because this is stuff that we've hard-coded. On our dashboard, this is not dynamic, and you generally don't want to test for things that are not dynamic. The reason I wanted to show you this is because it's a very straightforward, simple thing to get up and running so that you can see the use of visit and page has content. So I think what we'll do now is, if there's no more questions, which I don't see any more questions in Slack, let's take another 5-minute Pomodoro. So 3:15. And then we'll come back and actually look at some dynamic stuff and how to test that. And if you think of questions during the Pomodoro, feel free to post them in Slack as well, and we'll come back to them. All right, let's go ahead and come back together. So we're going to continue with the slides now that we've created one test, just to understand like what are the pieces involved in Capybara. So we get some new methods here. Visit page has content. We know that we need to include the Capybara DSL. We require it in our test helper. We set the app, and then in our gem file, we have it as well. So now that we have the pieces working, we're going to test some interactions, and this will be where we get dynamic data as well. So one of the things that Capybara gives us is a method called fill-in, and fill-in takes 2 arguments. It can take optional arguments in addition to these, but these are the 2 that we're going to be using. So fill-in takes an identifier. Again, when I say identifier, I mean a CSS selector. So that can be a class, it can be an ID, or just a plain HTML element. And then with would be whatever you actually want to type into that box. So fill-in identifier with content is representing the user interaction of typing some text into a text field or a text area. So what that might look like, if I take it over to the example here, I'm gonna get rid of that, is, so we might have fill in maybe like task title with whatever you want here, do laundry. So that's what this interaction would look like. By the way, quick aside, you'll see right here, these are curly quotes, whereas if I just were to type quotes into my text editor, we have straight quotes. This will really screw up programs, and in a not, like the error that you get back will not be very easy to figure out. So if you're copying and pasting from something, especially like a Microsoft Word document or an Excel file or even Slack or a Keynote or whatever, just make sure that the characters that are being used are actually what your text editor like by default would type. So just a side note there. Then we also have some other interactions. So click link, click button, click link or button. This one, or I guess the first 2, they're pretty self-explanatory. Click link, click button. Identifier in this case is not going to be HTML elements or CSS selectors. It's actually going to be the text that's on that link. So to show you what I mean, if I have a link here and it's like, it's going to like /task/new, and it says new task, then in my test, I would say click link new task, because this string needs to match the text that appears to the user from their perspective. So putting in this is not going to be what you see in these click links. It's going to be the actual text that appears on from the user's end. Same type of thing for if you had a button, or I guess like more commonly for our use case would be like a submit button. And maybe the value is create task. And so assume this is inside of a form. That's where we have inputs. But my Capybara test would say click button, create task, because value is what appears to the user from their perspective. So we have those 2. And then if you don't care whether it's clicking a link or a button, you're just trying to click on some piece of text, then you can use this method, click link or button. I would staying away from this one unless you can think of a good reason to do it, just because this gives you less control over what you are targeting. Whereas if you just say click link or click button, then you do have the control. The other thing that can get confusing about click link or button, let's say, for example, you had a nav bar, and in that nav bar, you have a, maybe you have a link that says create account, and you would expect users to click on that if they want to like go fill in a form. But then when they're on that form, they fill in their stuff, and your button to submit the form also says create account, but they still see that nav bar there. If you use click link or button, you're going to get an ambiguous element match, because it's going to see the link in the nav bar for creating an account, It's also going to see the button for submitting the form, and that can get a little bit hairy. So I would say if you know what your elements are, use one of these two on top. We also have assert equal current path. So current path is something that we get from Capybara after we've visited a certain page. Just like we get the object called page, we also get this object called current path. And current path will return to you just a string of whatever path you're on. So if I were to visit the home page and then try to see what current path was, it would be exactly what you see here, just slash. The reason you would want to use assert equal current path would be if your server is doing a redirect of some sort. Then you would want to make sure it redirected to the correct place. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to, I'm going to change this back into Ruby. So if I were to say visit slash and then assert equal slash current path, this combination doesn't make sense because we've told it to go there. So the current path is whatever we gave it. The reason this would make sense is, let's say that we visited slash tasks slash new, and then we filled in a whole bunch of stuff, and then we click button submit. This would now make sense to assert that the current path is slash or wherever you're going. Maybe you're going to slash tasks. But since we didn't explicitly in our test say to go to slash tasks, this assertion now makes sense. So that's another thing that we can assert for. Save and open page is one of my favorite debugging tools when I'm using Capybara. And the way that save and open page works is that if you're getting a failure for some reason, so let's say I was in this test and it's finding greeting, but it's still failing on this for some reason. What I can do is I can put save and open page right in here. To get this to work smoothly, you'll want to include one more gem, but it's not necessary. You'll just have to open the page by hand. If we include the launchy gem in our gem file, so gem launchy, what it will do when it hits that line save and open page is it will pop open your web browser. That's what launchy is doing. It will automatically open your web browser for you. And it will display a, it's not like your interactive web page. It's just the snapshot in time of what it was seeing. So let me just show you this really quick. So all I did was add launchy in my gem file. I added save and open page above my assertion, and I'm in a bundle so that I have launchy. And then I'm going to run my test again. And you'll see that what it did is it opened up this snapshot. And we see that it's a snapshot because it's file, not HTTP. So if I try to click on any of these, none of them work because it's not live links. But this just shows me what exactly did Capybara see at the moment that it was failing. And so my test is passing, so I don't really need save and open page. But if you get to a place where it's I can't find this field, or I don't see this HTML element or whatever, you can come over to your browser. Another helpful thing, and Andrew probably showed you this on the Bootstrap class lesson day, but you can use your inspector to look at certain elements. I know this is probably super small in the video. I'll do my best to make it big without losing functionality here. But I can look at all the HTML that it was saying. So I can see that in this H1, it has an ID of greeting. This could help with oh, maybe I forgot an E in it, and I can double check that. So save and open page is just a great debugging tool to be able to see what is Capybara seeing at that moment. All right, so let's go ahead and keep going here. So we're going to do a little bit of a workshop, and we're going to do it in pairs. I'll let you in your pair decide how you best want to do this, but my suggestions would either be through DMs or through Screen Hero. And so that workshop that we're going to work on is 3 feature tests. the process of creating a task, the process of editing a task, and the process of deleting a task. The test that we already wrote, this feature test, I would just delete it if I were you, because this is hard-coded stuff that we don't actually want to assert for. So to get started on that first one with your pair, if you want to leave it as an example just to help you get set up, that's fine. But you want to actually create a brand new file. So I'm going to save this as user creates a new task, test.rb. I would set it up exactly the same. And for each new feature, you want a new file. When I say new feature, I'm talking about like a different piece of functionality that the user can complete. So I would have a new file for user creates a new task. I would have another file for user can edit a task, and I would have another file for user can delete a task. And you might think like that seems very, I don't know, wasteful maybe, but one thing you want to consider is that in these tests, there could be multiple sad paths. For example, what happens if a user enters a title, or maybe they enter a description, but they don't enter a title? Should that be allowed? What should happen, etc.? We don't have any validations in this app, so it doesn't really matter for our use case, but down the road, this test, this one test, user creates a new task test, could have the happy path. It could have a sad path of missing title. It could be a sad path of maybe like description is too long or contains invalid characters. There could be multiple sad paths that would all go in this one file because they're all about creating a new task. All right, so let's head back to Slack. Let's see, yeah, Jonathan, that's fine if you want to go ahead and pair. We're going to use the pairs generator, and then we'll just shift people around if we need to. So all right, so where's Jonathan? Oh wait, that's definitely the wrong group. Okay, that should be better. Okay, actually, I think this hasn't been updated with the current people. So let's change Neve, you'll be pairing with wait, hang on. I guess only I can see this. Okay, give me 1 second here. All right, let's have somebody post an example of the create a task test, and then we can kind of look over the pieces and answer any questions here. So it looks like, let's have Cami, if you can post just that code snippet of the user creates a task test in Slack and then we can talk about that. Maybe Cami is not on the call yet. Let's have, oh, nope, she's typing, never mind. All right, so we have user can create a task test and include test helpers, include Capybara DSL. So that looks good right there. Test user can create a new task. So we're visiting the root, we're clicking on a link new task. We're making sure we're on that path. And this is a good example of using assert equal current path, because this doesn't really give us any information. Let me blow this up here because it's probably pretty small in the video. This doesn't give us any information about, or sorry, this right here, about where exactly we should be. So we can assert that the current path is /task/new. Then we're gonna fill in the task title with Learn Capybara. And this right here may have taken a little bit of time to figure out, but fill in, we usually target by either the ID or the label. In Rails, it's actually gonna attach the label very easily for you. In Sinatra, we're gonna use the ID field. So if we were to look at that view, which we have here, the, or sorry, not the ID, the name. So in this case, we can say name task title, and we can fill that in with Learn Capybara, and then same thing with the description input. So we have task description, and we're gonna fill it in with this text right here. We click on create task, and this is something that you may or may not have gotten stuck on. In this case, we have to give this a value. So we would say value, and to get this test to pass, we would want the value to be create task. And value is gonna be what appears on the button. So when the user renders this form, they see 2 input areas and then 1 button that says create task. So Capybara is gonna click on that button, create task. We're gonna make sure that we're back on the index. And again, this is another good use of the current path assertion here. And then we're gonna scope our query to a class of task. So we can come back to /task would be the index. And we don't have the class of tasks, but we could add it here. I would suggest changing this to, well, I guess it depends on how you've structured it. If you have the class of task, I'm assuming that you have maybe put a div here with class task, and then close your div after all of this. That's what I'm assuming you did. So that it only looks, as it's iterating over all the tasks, is only looking within here. If we had more than one task, which we don't, because since this is a test, it's gonna clear the database each time. But if we did have more than one task, let's say we had created some in our setup, then this would not work because it would find more than one task when we iterate over it. So that test looks good. Let's see. So if there's any questions, go ahead and post them in Slack. I am gonna stay on this call. I know that we got started a little bit late because Google Hangouts wasn't working on my end, but I'm gonna stay on the call for a little while longer just so I can go over the edit and the delete with people who wanna stay on the call and work on that for a little while. So what I'll do is I'll just hang out here, go ahead and work on edit and delete, and then for, let's say like 4:20-ish, I'll get back on and talk through solutions or potential ways to write that test. In the meantime, if you do have questions, go ahead and post them in Slack.